There are 9 terrestrial biomes, ranging all the way from the tundra, which is one of the least productive, to the tropical rainforest, which is the most productive. We'll look at that here in a second, and you'll see an example that we talked about last time. And then there are 3 freshwater biomes, and then 5 marine biomes. All of these are listed in the text. You'll have copies of the slides. These don't even have the definition, so I'm going to advance by this. I know you're frantically trying to write these down, but they're available in other places. We're going to think about these in a more practical and applicable sense than just the list of the definitions, like I said. So let's start here. Let's see. Now that it's really messing up. Some of the things didn't come true. Sorry, give me a moment. I got this error that I'd never seen before on any slide thing that I'd ever seen. Let me see if I can get this to run. Sorry, gang. What you're going to see in a second coming up on the slide is that same graph that I showed on the very first day of our lecture on this unit. Going to take it from right here. I just deleted a few of those things. So this should be familiar to you. It shows all those same biomes that were on the previous slide, and we ended our lecture on the first day saying, well, what do you think would be the relative latitude for each one of these biomes? And we were trying to figure out, so this is productivity on the x-axis, and over here shows you the category axis shows all of the biomes that are available. And what we kind of decided is, for the most part, it follows a fairly predictable pattern. Because sunlight and energy is the key to how much productivity there is in the ecosystem, the places that are most productive are probably going to be where on the planet? What relative latitude? Where would be the most productive? 0, near the equator, where you get the most solar insolation across all months of the year. But it doesn't hold true all of the time. Can everybody read this? This is in black. It's a little dark and light in here. This is going to be our first thing that we're going to think about. So the tundra, which my other map that I had to delete for purposes of being able to see it, the tundra is in places like Alaska and across the Arctic North and the northern territories of Canada. So that's where I want you to picture it in this world map that I had to delete. And the grasslands is in southern Africa, which is about between in the equator, just to the south, about 20 degrees southern latitude. So it would show you where those two are on the map. But I want you to try to answer this question right here. The first one. List and describe all the climatological factors that apply or would influence productivity in this area. We already know sunlight, so that's a give me. Put it on your Canvas quiz. You're going to do it. This is only going to be 1 minute. Should be fairly simple, and we'll talk about the answers together. Everybody should answer this on the Canvas quiz. You'll submit the whole thing at the end. Tundra is in the north, and the grasslands, which is similarly productive, is kind of near the equator, about 20 degrees south. Yeah.
Will you still be able to repeat these questions and answer that?
Yeah. Yes. You'll have your answers and my answers. So, what kinds of things did we come up with besides sunlight? What other things? Yeah. Precipitation is a big one. Reed? Elevation is a big one. Morgan? Permafrost. This area, if that's a new word to you, places that are permanently frozen. That's a fairly easy definition, Solely.
Temperature.
The temperature. I like all of these. Anything else?
Presumably less primary producers in tundras.
Less primary producers in tundras. So now we're thinking about about this link between the biotic and just the climatological factors. That's good. Anything else? Yeah.
Not just primary producers, but secondary producers and tertiary producers as well.
How many of all kinds? There's only primary producers, but I see where you're going. The word that you want is consumers. So how many levels in the trophic level? So what tells us how much precipitation, how much temperature, and all of that? How do we know? It's this big thing.
Latitude.
The latitude, and there's this big process that we learned a lot about. This big process that tells you, for example, why is there no rain at 30 degrees, but there is at 60 degrees?
Convection cycle.
The convection cycle, right? So knowing where we're at in the convection cycle really matters for helping us understand the productivity of an ecosystem. Beautiful. Let's continue on here. Here's another graph that you've seen before, but I want to break it down and think about it in a new way. This is a climatogram, and there are a couple things to pay attention to. Along the category axis on the bottom is months of the year, so right here. And then there are two wide value axes, one on the left side and one on the right side. One corresponds with the amount of precipitation, usually represented in blue because that's fairly intuitive. Well, it's the amount of water, so blue makes sense for that. And then the amount of temperature or heat energy is usually represented in red, and then they correspond with their respective axes. So we kind of know how to read these, looking across, and we've seen this before. Well, you'd expect there to be a lot of heat energy here. This is probably somewhere in northern hemisphere because it's the most productive during the summer seasons in North America. But here's a new thing to this graph that I really want to pay attention to, and it goes with the definition that's over here on the left side. The limiting factor. So this shows one of the limiting factors. It says, I'm just going to read this out loud because I like the way our authors of the text articulated it. When the precipitation line is below the temperature line, that means that this area is limited in terms of productivity for water. So it's the precipitation is what's causing it to be limited. So in a place like 30 degrees north or 30 degrees south, those areas still receive plenty of sunlight in order to be productive, but they don't get enough water. So they're limited in terms of precipitation. We can see that in part of a climatogram. Here are some other limiting factors. So precipitation is one of the biggest and one of the most obvious. Why would precipitation limit productivity? And I want to know a specific reason why. It has to do with biogeochemical cycles. Yeah?
If there wasn't any rain, plants or primary producers couldn't actually grow.
Plants need water to grow. That's good, primary producers. So what do they use water for? It's a critical input and something that we talked a lot about. And photosynthesis, right? So while they have plenty of sunlight energy, they need water in order to make what? As the output? Glucose, for sure. So precipitation matters a lot. Solar insolation, or the amount of sunlight we've talked about a lot, that matters. The amount of nutrients, which is the other biogeochemical cycles. Nitrogen, phosphorus, there's cycles for magnesium, calcium. We've mostly focused on carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus in our class. And we even, in phosphorus, talked about it being a limiting nutrient for life. It's needed to produce ATP, which is critical for metabolism. Temperature matters. Something like the permafrost, as Morgan mentioned. And then the last one, soil configuration. That means the physical and chemical properties of the soil have to be such that they would actually support what sort of thing? What do all these point at? When I say productivity, what are we talking about? Primary producers. The more primary producers you have, the more trophic levels, the more energy flow can go through those ecosystems. So if we want to know how many foxes, owls, deer, or anything else that can survive in the ecosystem, the first thing we need to know, well, how many plants can live there? Here's a little exercise for us to think through here. So I want you to look at this graph, and I've given you the definition for vegetative vigor here at the bottom, but I want you to interpret these things again on canvas, answer these two questions. We'll go for 2 minutes. Y-axis goes with the vegetative vigor here. It's hard to read, but it's just a value for vegetative vigor. Vegetative vigor here.
Oh, okay. When you say max, and do you mean for both graphs, or do you just mean?
Yes, please. Good question. Take a second just to finish up your answers, and let's think about this a little bit out loud, can we? I'm going to assume that we are able to navigate question 1 fairly well about identifying the axes as just a way to step through this graph and interpret what's going on. What do you think is the most important part? Let's look at number 2 and 3 inside of part 1, the maximum and minimum values. First, can we decide which one of these is in the northern and southern hemisphere by looking at this? Which one is in the northern hemisphere? Campbell?
It would be the North American tundra.
Oh, because of the North American tundra, it's a giveaway. But using the graph.
Well, you can also tell because in our summer months would be like June through August. Those are when plant productivity is at the highest, and it's obviously going to be.
Because of the tilt of the earth, the productivity is the highest during these months. And what's the link there? Because this is vegetative vigor. So what's the thing that's available there that's not available in December, January, and February? Yeah?
Direct sunlight is different.
The concentration of direct sunlight. That's a great answer. That's a great answer. This one you can tell is in the southern hemisphere, it's the opposite trend, right? Where the vegetative vigor is the lowest during these months, June, July, and summer. So, number 2 is the big idea here. We know something about plant health. Well, how does that help us picture what the ecosystem looks like? What kinds of things would come up for number 2? Who wants to give me something? I gotta go. Campbell's on fire today. We gotta go somewhere else. Garrett?
We know during which months primary producers are thriving and
So we know which months our primary producers are thriving. So what is the rest of the makeup of the ecosystem? Does plants tell us the whole story? Are these very productive ecosystems? Are there more productive ecosystems? How would it look in a more productive ecosystem? If I was going to show a third graph, what would be an example of a more productive ecosystem? Anybody? Yeah.
I like a straight line across.
A straight line across, and maybe if we had that where there was a lot of vegetative vigor all year, what kind of biome do you think that would be? Something obvious. Like a tropical rainforest, right? Beautiful. All right, let's continue on here. Here's another example, and now that we've thought through that, this is that same ecosystem, so there's not a lot of new information here, except for I've layered. This is for the North American tundra. This on the right side is for the grasslands, but now I'm giving you a new data point. So now we are also showing surface temperature is the triangles, and monthly precipitation is the dots. So this is a temperature graph, this shows precipitation, and then this is the same for that ecosystem. I want you to answer these questions, which look a lot like questions that would show up on an assessment. Identifying what's going on in terms of limiting factor. I want well-written answers for this. We're going to take a little extra time here. We'll go for about 4 minutes on this one. Go ahead and go. Let's look at these together again just really quickly here. For the North American tundra, what do you think is the limiting factor given the information you have? Yeah, Morgan?
Surface temperature, because it appears the most connected with plant growth.
We see what appears to be a tight correlation between surface temperature and plant vigor here. Those two graphs match one another. So given the evidence that we've seen, those two seem to go together. What about on this one? Somebody else for the tundra. Charles?
Monthly precipitation, because it's kind of the same temperature for the other one. It lines up pretty well. In like July, when you get no precipitation, you get the lowest plant vigor in the next month.
Beautiful. Great. Everybody feel okay about these sorts of things? Interpreting graphs like this, you may be presented with climatograms and other ancillary information about productivity, and you should be able to talk a lot in a well-reasoned way about what that ecosystem looks like, and you should almost be able to paint a picture based on the productivity observed of what the ecosystem would look like. Great job on that. I feel good. Hopefully you guys had good answers on that. We're going to continue on here. I want to talk a little bit about aquatic biomes as well, which is the neglected child. We spend a lot of time thinking about what are the ecosystem makeup or how are we influencing things in terrestrial biomes, but I also want to make sure that we know what's going on with marine and freshwater, or otherwise just known as aquatic biomes. So here are the limiting factors, and you'll see some of them are the same. Obviously, temperature and solar insolation matter. Even in the water, you need primary producers. We saw an example of a primary producer in an aquatic ecosystem. Algae is one of the most common. Salinity, so the amount of salt. Organisms are sensitive to the concentration of salt, and that varies across especially different marine biomes, but in freshwater biomes, organisms can tolerate a certain amount of salt or intolerant to certain concentrations. Nutrient levels, which is one that we saw on the previous, that's the same. And then dissolved oxygen, which will tell us, well, all organisms need to breathe, so there needs to be a lot of water availability as well. Let's just think a little bit. I have to put this in here because the text points it out, and I think that it's important. It's the sort of thing that comes up on the AP test a lot. I'm not into these terms as much, but I felt like they would be important to mention now. We're going to look at them a little bit later. But we have certain ways to talk about freshwater aquatic zone ecosystem. So this is a picture from the text. And then we have these three specific terms that tell us, well, what does the amount of productivity look like across these? Well, the lowest productivity is down here in the profundal zone. We call that oligotrophic. Trophic refers to the amount of energy, so like food, trophic levels, that part of the word, but the oglio means it's not available. Mesotrophic, somewhere in the middle, and then eutrophic means there's a high level of productivity. These terms we won't worry about as much now, but they will come up again when we look at pollution especially. Similarly, in the ocean, the main thing that we care about...
Could you go back just for a second?
These slides will also be available. Also, these key terms are in the text. I just wanted to point them out here. In the open ocean, we have zones that we're talking about as well, and they correspond with what is the most important thing. Well, we already know if we want to define an ecosystem or talk about a biome, the level of productivity is the key thing. And so in the open ocean, we have a really low level of productivity. The photic zone, which makes sense, it's an area where photosynthesis can occur. The aphotic zone, which is a layer of the ocean that doesn't have very much sunlight, so down in lower areas here. And then chemosynthesis is this place, they mentioned it in the text, so I put it here as well, but there are some organisms that don't require energy from the sun. They survive on chemical energy only, and those are usually, amazingly, at the bottom of the ocean. But these help us tease out, well, what level of productivity are we talking about at what place. Nothing new here, though. The most important thing in aquatic ecosystems is the amount of sunlight and whatever the limiting factors are. If we know what the productivity looks like, we should be able to talk a lot about what's going on there. Last thing for us to do here, I want you to compare the open ocean, which gives you over here, and coral reefs, and think about what's going on with the levels of productivity for each of these. Last one to do. Oh, I don't have a song. That's all right. We'll just go. I'll find a song. I got a good one. Go for about 1 more minute more on this question. All right, let's talk about this one a little bit. Let's look at number 1 to begin with. What's the biggest difference that you see? I mean, I put a couple pictures in case you were unfamiliar with these. Sully?
Coral reefs receive the most sunlight, which allows for the process of photosynthesis, whereas at an open ocean, the sunlight can't reach the bottom, so they can't undergo photosynthesis, which is a driver for productivity.
I like this answer, but there's a key thing that I want to zoom in on. So he said lot of productivity and a lot of sunlight in the coral reefs and that. But I just want to look. I tried to choose really good photos. Doesn't it look like the amount of sunlight here in the open ocean is pretty good? In the Pacific Ocean, as an example, or the Atlantic, there's plenty of ocean that's right at the equator, which receives sufficient amount of solar insolation all year. Well, let's look at the coral reefs here. Let me go ahead and see what you were going to say.
So the primary producers, a lot of times, so in the coral reefs, they're more at the top, so they're receiving more sunlight.
More at the top in terms of layers of the water, they're closer to the surface.
And then on the open ocean, a lot of the primary producers are at the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah.
So they get less sunlight, so there's less of an abundance of it.
So I like this answer. What's really interesting, though, is in either of these pictures, do you see primary producers? We're using some background knowledge, but do you see a lot of primary producers? This is coral. What you see here is mostly limestone, the part that you're seeing, just as an interesting thing to note. How do you know this one's more productive if you don't really see a lot of primary producers? There's a ton of other fish and organisms. What do those fish and other organisms need? They need energy, they need nutrients. So in order for those to even be there, then we know because of the trophic levels and the way the food chain and food web is constructed from what we talked about previously, there must be a lot of primary productivity here if it's going to support this level of life, where in here we see almost no life. Let's see if we can zoom in on number 2 and tease out this answer a little bit more. Obviously, primary productivity really matters. If I go back a slide here, a couple slides here, here again are the limiting factors. So the second question says, well, what are the limiting factors that would contribute to this? Here they are again. What do you think it is for the open ocean? Why is it less productive? Does anybody else want to answer? Anybody? Oh, Nick. The level of nutrients is maybe lower there. I definitely agree with that answer. I like it. Why?
I was trying to answer the other question.
Oh, sure.
The other ones. The other factors that would influence it would be solar insolation and temperature, because the depth of the open ocean would kind of dilute the sunlight entering it, and the greater volume of water over the larger area would also create a greater temperature diffusion.
For sure, which is sometimes true and sometimes false. Well, it depends. Most of the time it trends, as you're saying, but we have all kinds of climatological factors, like it's warmed by Europe because of thermohaline, or El Nino warms up parts of the ocean. So heat of the ocean can be a problem in some times, but sometimes not. But in the open ocean, even during a El Nino year in the middle of the Pacific, there's plenty of heat energy there, but yet still no organisms. Nutrients is one reason why. What else could we come up with?
Dissolved oxygen levels, because the coral reef has a whole lot of...
What do we need for dissolved oxygen? Because interestingly, where does the oxygen in the water come from? Some of it is absorbed from the atmosphere, which we haven't focused on much, but our lab just showed us something really interesting. That plant life, and then help me build the link that we did earlier. How do we end up with that? Yeah.
Well, through the process of photosynthesis, like more oxygen.
Photosynthesis as one of its byproducts, glucose, which we talked about previously, and oxygen as well. If we have a high level of productivity happening in terms of photosynthesis, we should also have a lot of oxygen. Lots of oxygen means, so it's definitely dissolved oxygen. It could be some of these other ones, but those could be buried. But the nutrient levels, if we have no existing matter there, how much nutrient cycling? We predominantly focus again on nitrogen and phosphorus cycles for terrestrial biomes, but wouldn't fish and other organisms also need those critical inputs? How would they get those if they have no nutrient cycling, if there's no trophic levels, if there's no productivity to support life, then you don't have the other critical nutrients to support life as well. I want to just talk about one last thing here that isn't up on the slides, but I just want to leave it as an open question. What is one of the things that occurs if organisms need food, but it's not in their current ecosystem? What do they usually do? They usually move or migrate to new areas. So when we're thinking about ecosystem makeup and the boundaries of an ecosystem, we're going to focus more on what are the primary producers than what are the consumers, because consumers can move around. And so if we see like something like a hawk in this area, but we're not expecting that we could support one, well, it might just be the hawk moving through due to migration and chasing food. So when you think about, I just want to drive that point home, that the boundaries of an ecosystem or the makeup of the ecosystem is much more about the primary producers than any of the other levels, any of the other trophic levels. Everybody feel okay? Tough lecture today. As you read 12 and 13, or as you review 12 and 13, think about it using this format. Well, I want to look at these biomes and figure out what is the limiting factor, what is the primary producers that make that, help make that ecosystem look the way that it is. That's the key thing that I need you to know, more than if I show you a picture that you need to identify this is a tropical rainforest. That doesn't matter as much, but you will have to identify a biome based on this sort of thing, the makeup of the ecosystem. Sound good? Assessment for us is on Monday. Tomorrow in this class we're going to do a little working with biomes and constructing some things. We're going to do a little math practice, have a little space, do a little, get ourselves oriented so that we can come and do that assessment on Monday. Great job today, gang. Make sure you submit the quiz on Canvas. It'll immediately give you the answers back that I wrote in as feedback, so you can see that as part of your study preparation. It's available to you, but hit submit so we can see it as well. Have a great day.
The homework, just review the modules.
Thank you.
See ya.
He was.
My mom says let it.
I got us out at the right time, didn't I, Ethan? 35 is the right time, isn't it?